Alright, welcome to lesson 5 in module 2 of the Ultimate ZBrush Guide course. And in this video, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Dynamic Subdivision, what it is, when to use it, what it can be used for, and why it's such a powerful tool to know inside ZBrush. And I'm going to show you why it's so important to know it, especially early on in the process. Alright, so I'm going to switch to the full screen mode. Alright, so as always, let's go ahead and load the custom UI for this video. So let's go to load UI and let's go ahead and select the dynamic underscore subdivision underscore M02 underscore L05. So lesson 5 for module 2. So let's go ahead and click open. And not a lot of things change in this UI. I just moved a couple of things around and I added a few things. So let me just bring my Epic pen here. Right, so I just added these two buttons, right? 1 and 2 buttons. I moved these ones to the right. Right, and I added this section here for dynamic subdivision. So I'm gonna get to all of this, but it's gonna be a pretty short video, I think, because once you get the hang of it, it's really easy. All right, so to explain what dynamic subdivision is and how we're gonna use it, I'm gonna use a set of cubes that I have prepared. So all of these cubes are actually the same cube, or at least the same model, but with different approaches or different settings in the dynamic subdivision. So I'm going to select the first one here and I'm going to turn on polyframe so that we can see what's actually going on. So as you can see, we have here a pretty basic form of geometry, a simple cube that has a subdivision on each face, and we already talked about all that before, so nothing new so far. Now what's different or new in this case is that this simple cube and this simple shape is being turned into all these different types of cubes just by changing the dynamic subdivision settings. So dynamic subdivision is essentially subdividing a mesh, so using this divide button that we already know about, but dynamically. So what that means is if we use dynamic subdivision, we don't actually have to subdivide anything. It's just previewing it in a way. So the easiest way to think about dynamic subdivision with all of its settings and everything would be to think about it as a smooth preview. All right, so that would be the easiest way to think about dynamic subdivision. It's just a smooth preview that allows you to visualize a bunch of different options before you commit to subdividing or before you apply that dynamic subdivision. So let's go ahead and have a look at the different settings. So, and of course, this is what we have here in this UI, right? So before we use any of this, and you'll see why I only have a few buttons here, but I want to show you everything so that if you, for some reason, want to achieve something like this, you can do so from those settings. So I'm going to go ahead and select the second cube by holding Alt and click, and you already know about this shortcut because I already explained that, and that is an easy way to move through the subtools. So as you can see, this one is also pretty similar to this cube, and this is the basic or the most basic form of dynamic subdivision. So what we have here really is the same cube. So if you look at these little points, those vertices, if we connect those, what we get is essentially the first cube, right? So the same thing. So the dynamic subdivision is simply generating a preview of how smooth this would look if we were to subdivide it with certain settings. But that's it. That's about it, right? And the great thing about this dynamic subdivision is that we have these vertices or these points that allows us to manipulate just a few vertices, the original ones, but we get a preview or the result in a much smoother surface. So for instance, if I go to the move brush, and let's go ahead and right click and increase the brush size, and I take, let's say, these points here, and I push them up, something like that, you still get this very nice, I'm going to clear this now, you get this nice curvature here, right? Very nice and rounded, and that is all done because of the dynamic subdivision. And you see here, the switch is now enabled when I selected this mesh. Now, if we turn off dynamic subdivision, what we're going to end up with is just a representation of this basic form, something like that. Very hard edges. So let's just do that just to test that out. I'm going to turn off dynamic with this button here in the custom UI. right? And let's turn on what I just mentioned. So that is essentially it. So this line, this yellow line, is dynamic subdivision, whereas the blue one is basically the deformation of the original cube. So hopefully that makes sense. But basically, like I said, all you need to remember is that these cubes are exactly the same thing. It's just that this one, the second one, has dynamic subdivision enabled. Not at this point, but that's what I had before. And because of the dynamic subdivision, it allows us to see a preview of how smooth this surface is going to look when we move those vertices. So if I go ahead and clear this up and enable dynamic again here from this custom UI, right? This is the result. I'm going to undo these movements because I want to keep it clean and simple. And then we have another option here, right? So let's go ahead and hold the Alt key, and I'm going to click on this one. So this one it looks definitely smoother than this other one, right? It's still the same thing, the same cube, but it looks, the surface looks a bit smoother. It's harder to tell where the polygons are, where the faces are, and that is because the amount of subdivision that I'm previewing is much more. So if you pay attention to the second bit or the second element in the custom UI that I created, is called the smooth subdivision. Okay, and this slider allows you to preview these in a very, very smooth way, or in the in the most basic shape, which is this one. So if I take this slider and push it back to 1, what we get is an in between this one. It's kind of like this, right? And in between a super hard edge and this one that is a little bit smoother, right? But let's go ahead and turn this off. If I keep smoothing this, say to 2, right? Or 3, it starts to become way more smoother than this one, right? So I can go 4, even 5, more than 5. If you go to 6, it's probably a bit of an overkill, but it's going to be very smooth. If I turn off polyframe, you see it's very, very clean, right? It's totally up to you, but this one is just a preview. So that's why it's such a good tool. And I'll show you why in just a second in more practical terms. I just want to give you an introduction to it and why we have these tools in here. So I think it was in 4. Yep. So it's very, very, very smooth. Now, this is great again because even if we have this at a smooth subdivision of 5 or 6, which is super, super smooth, we can still edit just a few points to deform this entire shape. And that allows us to work a little bit faster and much more accurately. So I can take this one, push it up, right? So you get that very nice deformation. It's very, very smooth. And if I toggle dynamic off, you'll see this is actually what is happening in the real, into the real geometry, or to the underlying geometry. So let me undo that. All right. So go back to 4, and let's go ahead and select the next one. So I'm going to hold the Alt key and click on it just to select it. And you'll see, although this one maintains the shape of the original cube a little bit more, it's still, it has a nice bevel edge or a nice curvature here around the edges. But the smooth subdivision is set to 2, right? So this one is actually, if you pay attention here to these values and the switches here, this is exactly the same thing to this one, right? It also has 2 smooth subdivision, and this one as well. So how come these two look so different? Now the reason is because within the dynamic subdivision settings, we have other options to change how much bevel and how much chamfer and constant we can actually add to the edges. So that's what I wanted to show you, and in case you want to use it, but I'm going to show you a practical example of those later on. But the reason I didn't put them in the custom UI is because for the purpose of this course and what we're doing, we're not going to get into those for the character at least. But it's good to know that they are there in case you want to, create something like this later on. So if we go and scroll down to the geometry palette, right? So this is the geometry palette that we're going to use quite a bit. And of course, it is within the geometry palette since we're essentially editing the geometry or changing the way that the geometry looks like. We have this dynamic subdivision section just right below the main geometry tools. So I'm going to hold shift and expand that. And these are essentially the tools that I added to the UI. So we have dynamic, which is essentially the on-off switch to enable it or to preview it. Then we have this apply, which is this one here. And I'm gonna get to that in a second. And then I have the smooth subdivision, which is this one here, right? But then we have a bunch of other sliders and switches that are pretty useful, and these ones are the ones that allows us to create these type of things. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn that off. All right. So the difference between this cube and the second one that I showed you is that in this fourth cube, I have increased this flat subdivision. So if you remember in previous videos, we talked about this switch right here, the subdivide smooth modifier, and what it does. So if we turn this off and we decided to divide the geometry, right, it will basically subdivide the actual geometry, but it's going to keep everything pretty hard in terms of the edges. It's not going to perform that Cadman-Clark subdivision that we also talked about, right? So this flat subdivision is pretty much the same thing. It allows you to do the same as subdividing the model, but without smoothing it. So if I go ahead and turn smooth subdivision to 0, right, and get a little bit closer here, it looks exactly the same as the first cube, although there are 3 levels of flat subdivision. Okay, so what that means is that if I combine flat subdivision with a smooth subdivision, we can end up with something that looks much nicer along the edges, but it will preserve the shape of the cube a little bit more. So let me just give you again an example of that. So it's going to be very hard to actually see the flat subdivision in the actual cube because there's no smoothing in the surface, and this is a preview. So it's kind of like pointless to use this unless you want to just set it to 4 and then apply it and then continue working. But I'll get to that in a second. But let's set it to 1, for example, right? And then let's take the smooth subdivision, the one that actually smooths the surface, to 1, and this is what we get. Now we can start smoothing this to 2, or like increase that to 2, and you'll see the difference that makes. We can keep smoothing things even more with the smooth subdivision, and you get the idea, right? Is this combining smoothing with the amount of flat subdivision, right? So if I put this smooth subdivision to 4, right, it's going to be pretty smooth, but it's going to maintain the shape of this specific mesh or this cube a little bit more, right? But because the smooth subdivision is set at 4, and the previous cube also has a smooth subdivision of 4, if I remove the flat subdivision that this current one has, we're going to end up with pretty much the same, right? So really the difference between the third one and the fourth one is that in the fourth one, I just also added some flat subdivision just to get this type of edge. Now, if I add more, it's going to get even sharper to the edge, like so, and even more, like so. So you can play around with all of these settings. And that's what I wanted to show you, that you can take a simple cube like this, and probably a cube is a perfect example to actually explore these settings, and then just play around with this slider to see what type of smoothing and what type of preview you can get over the actual geometry. Now, all of this is just a preview, right? We haven't actually created any subdivisions. So let's go ahead and continue with these 3 more examples. So I'm going to select the next one. And this one has something very similar to what we did with the previous one. So actually, I'm going to try to achieve the same result that I have here with the previous one. So if we go ahead and remove some of the smooth subdivision and also the flat ones, something like that probably. Let's have a look. Something like that, roughly. It's not going to be exactly the same, but it's going to be pretty similar. So you'll see that adding 2 flat subdivision levels plus 1 smooth subdivision in this case, it gives us a very similar effect in this other cube, right? So they're pretty similar, and you can just tell by how this is being smoothed here in the corner, right? So it's pretty similar. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but it's pretty close. The difference is that this one is not using any of those flat subdivision to achieve this shape. This one instead is actually using the Q grid, right? And the Q grid is kind of like a virtual grid that is being added to the mesh. And I know this might be a little bit weird to wrap your head around, but when I get to the practical stuff, it will make more sense. I just want to give you a little bit of the theory behind and how this works before we move forward. So this Q grid is an awesome tool that is basically going to add to the preview, to the dynamic subdivision, is going to preview it with a grid like that, or a grid per each one of these faces, right? So if you increase this to a number of 2, it's going to be way more. more subdivisions, and you end up with even a sharper object. So let me just show you what I mean. So if I increase the Q grid from 1 to 2, you see it's started to become a little bit sharper. 5, and this is actually really, really useful to, for example, if you're doing something like hard surface modeling on that and that sort of thing, to maintain the sharpness of the edges, right? But that's just using the Q grid. We also have the coverage, and that's the one that allows you to dynamically and interactively change how much of this Q grid is being applied, right? And right now we have a subdivision of 1, but if you want even smoother surface, you can increase that to 2, right? So that you can see a little bit more of a rounded corner. But we can use the coverage to change how much bevel or how much of that effect is being applied. So that's why it's super powerful, because you can just have a simple cube, but using these tools just to quickly soften it and change the shapes a little bit more, right? That's one of the keys of this dynamic subdivision. The second one is that it allows you to edit the most basic or most primitive shape of your object with a very low geometry, and it's going to describe the changes, or it's going to give you the result in a much more smoother surface. And again, don't worry, I'm going to explain this in a much more practical way in just a second with the character. So let's just move forward a little bit faster with the other options. So I want to select this one here. And this one that looks a little bit weird is probably the one that is different from most of these other examples, because I'm using a Q grid, I'm using bevel, constant, a smooth subdivision of 4, and coverage. Okay, so bevel is just a switch that enables that beveling effect, right? And the constant as well, just give you a constant edge, and enabling or disabling these switches are going to give you a very different result, right? So what's great about this effect, or these these switches, is that you can also change the overall silhouette by selecting it and then playing with the coverage. For example, how much coverage of this bevel I'm adding. If I want the edges to be constant, I can also do that from there. You can add chamfer, and chamfer is the last option, which is actually a rounded or a more rounded bevel, okay, or a more rounded edge in a way. So let's go ahead and jump into the next one. And you'll see I have chamfer instead of bevel. And again, you can play around with this slider. So if I turn off the polyframe here with this switch, and if you compare these two, so this one is the one with chamfer, and that's why we have this more rounded effect, whereas this one has the bevel and still very round and nice, but you kind of tell where the corners are, or like the changes in direction of the angle. The chamfer is going to give you a smoother result. All right, so those are things that I know I'm going a little bit faster in this area, but those are things that honestly is much easier to just play around with those values, turning things on and off, so you get an idea of what they do and how they affect the models. The most basic ones and the most important ones that we're going to be using are the ones that I added to the custom UI, right? So this area here, we have dynamic, apply, and smooth subdivision. So just before we move into the character, let's talk about the apply button, okay? So I'm gonna select something like maybe this one. No, actually, let's go for the third one, okay? So this third one has 4 levels of smooth subdivision, right? And it's dynamic. So I can toggle it on and off, and you'll see the original mesh and the preview of how it would look like if we were to subdivide it, right? If we actually subdivide this with the normal subdivision method. So the apply button, what it does is actually applies the level of subdivision, right? So it actually performs the subdivision. Is no longer a preview, but it does it based on the settings that we choose. So if I go ahead and click apply, so you see all those little dots that we had here before, the actual vertices of this mesh, they disappear. And if you look up here in the geometry palette, now we have the subdivision slider, this one here, okay? So we can go back in subdivisions, right? So we have the nice rounded shape, but we can go back to the first one, and no longer this shape looks like a cube, right? Because the subdivision or the dynamic subdivision is being applied, and now this is the form that will, once it's subdivided, will describe this shape, okay? So you can still work, editing and you can still move things around. If you want to have more control of how you move things, you can just go to, let's say, subdivision level 2, move things around. Let's do it with the move brush, right? And then go up in subdivision levels, and you still get the same effect. It's just that now this is part of the geometry itself. It's no longer a preview. Okay, so let me undo that. And I'm going to show you the same thing with this other one that's a little bit weird. That one. So exactly the same thing. We just have different settings in the dynamic or in the preview, right? But it's still a simple cube like this one was. So if I go ahead and apply it using the button here from the custom UI, you see now we have 5 levels of subdivision. And let's go to the first one. And it looks very different from the first level of subdivision of this other cube. Okay? So if I jump between these two, they're both at the first level of subdivision, right? And they all come from this shape, which is the most basic shape. But because of the different settings that we use in this dynamic subdivision, ZBrush went ahead and changed the first level or the original shape of the cube to be like this. Okay, depending on the settings. So that's essentially what I wanted to show, that you can have a nice preview of the mesh just by playing with these settings. And then once you're ready, you can go ahead and apply the dynamic subdivision so that you can enter in this subdivision approach or having levels of subdivision. But again, I'm going to show you a practical example with the character that we're working on. At this point, I just wanted to give you a quick intro of what dynamic subdivision is and where are the settings and where to find it here in the geometry palette. So let's go for the more practical approach, and let's go ahead and select the character that we've been working on. All right. So all we're really going to do is work with a much smoother surface than what we have here, just so that we can visualize things a little bit nicer and we can decide how to adjust the shapes later on. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I have the body selected. I'm going to enable dynamic subdivision. And you see we have a pretty nice and smooth surface, right? And it's just a dynamic subdivision. And that's why these are the simplest of the settings. We're not going to worry too much about anything else unless you really want to, generate some of the shapes that I showed you before with the cubes. And I'm going to do the same thing with most of these shapes. So I'm going to select the claws here. I'm going to do the same thing, enable dynamic. And I'm selecting or switching between the subtools by holding the Alt key and selecting it from the canvas. And that's something that we already covered. A quick way to navigate or select subtools. So let's go ahead and enable dynamic for this as well. All right, so much smoother. I'm going to select the face or the head, enable dynamic. I'm going to select the head as well, this part here, enable dynamic. And for these very primitive shapes, the scarf here, you can do the same thing, dynamic, dynamic, and dynamic. All right, so this backpack, you can see it is a super simple shape. Let's go ahead and enable polyframe. Let's turn off dynamic. You see it's a very, very simple shape, but turning on dynamic, we can have a much more smoother surface than a simple cube. And that's kind of like the idea of how I use or how we recommend you use the dynamic subdivision. A way of previewing how smooth this surface will look like, but also keeping it simple, keeping it very low poly while you actually adjust the shapes and generate a nice silhouette, but also that looks quite smooth. But that's it really. That's all there is to this step in this lesson, is actually taking your character, all the pieces that you currently have, which they're not as many, and go one by one and enable dynamic subdivision. If you want, you can actually increase the smoothness. So for instance, in the backpack here, we can hold the Alt key, click on it to make sure that it is selected, and increase the smooth subdivision. So from 2 to 3, and that gives us a smoother result. So again, that is the practical step, but I just wanted to give you an introduction to dynamic subdivision. Now the next thing that I want to introduce with this UI is the mirror and weld and the mirror button. So these are buttons that are absolutely essential in the process of creating characters or assets. So as the name suggests, it's just going to mirror whatever you select from one side to the other, and the mirror and weld is going to do the same thing, but it's going to weld it together. So let me just give you an example of what this is, and I'll show you where to find them in the UI. But it's important to have them, or at least I think it's good to have them in the custom UI so that you can always access them. Okay, so I'm going to select the hand, right? And I have that selected here. I'm going to increase the visible count, right? So I have the hand, or the big hand, and let's say I want to, instead of working on the right hand side, I want to actually move it to the other side. I can just go ahead and click mirror, right? And ZBrush is going to take whatever is on this side and mirror it to the other side. I'm going to go ahead and enable the floor, and I'm going to show you what is happening behind the scenes, right? So when you click mirror, ZBrush is going to take whatever you have on the x-axis, which is indicated by the red little line, and it's going to take it from this side and it's going to mirror it to the other side. Now, since ZBrush 2020, ZBrush is intelligent enough to recognize that if you don't have anything on the right hand side and you have something on the left, it's going to mirror it to the other side, or vice versa. Now, this is doing it on the x-axis because of this tiny little X that you can see here on top of this of the button. So you can actually do the same thing on the z-axis or in the y-axis. You can mirror it up and down, or back to front, depending on which one of these little letters you have chosen, right? So if you remember, I mentioned already that this line and this fill, for example, in the polyframe, you can toggle them on and off to change things like, if I toggle this on, you can turn off the fill color, or you can turn on the line color. So they're kind of like little UI elements that you can actually switch on and off within the switch, which is weird, but it's very, very handy, right? So it's the same thing with this mirror button. So I can actually, let's go ahead and mirror it again. So we'll send it back to where it was. I can actually change it to, let's say, the Z axis and toggle off the X, and you'll see now the Z is kind of like white color, and it's going to do it from this side to the other. So I'm going to mirror it, so it like flipped that the other way around, okay? And the same thing for the Y. So I just select that Y letter, and I do it up and down, okay? So that's this is just important to understand that this is what the mirror is doing, the mirror button. So I'm gonna flip it back to the way that it was and select X, which is the default one. And this is probably the only one that you're really going to be using, but it's important to know that those are there in case you want to use them. Okay, so I'm gonna mirror that as well. I'm gonna hold the Alt key and select the close, and I'm gonna mirror that as well. All right, so that's basically what the mirror does. Now, the mirror and weld does the same thing, but it actually merges things together. So I'm going to give you an example of what the mirror and weld does, and this is something that I use quite often. So if you remember, I'm going to go ahead and hold the Alt key and click on the hat, or the top of the head. If you remember, when we were sort of tweaking this shape a little bit, I used the smooth brush, but I use it intentionally without symmetry. So let's say if I toggle this off, and I go ahead and smooth this area, or an area here, using the smooth brush that lives in the Shift key, if you remember, right? So I'm just smoothing surfaces in here, but I'm not doing it with the symmetry on, right? Meaning that this side is going to be different from this side. And when we're working with symmetry, just as a workflow tip, it's good to maintain symmetry for as long as we can before we actually break symmetry and add details and so on and so forth. So in this case, the mirror and weld is what you want to use. So if I turn this on, I'm going to toggle Dynamic Subdivision just for the time being. So I can go ahead and let me actually make the smoothing a little bit more obvious. Or let's do it on this side. Right? So obviously, I don't want this, right? This is something that is not looking good. I want to actually have that sharp edge here on the left-hand side. So if I just mirror it, all I'm doing is flipping it, in other words. So I'm just changing the softness of this side from the right-hand side of the screen to the left one, just by mirroring. But with mirror and weld, ZBrush is going to take whatever is on this side, so all of this, and it's going to mirror it, and it's going to merge it. So in other words, it's going to recreate this shape, right? And that's exactly what I need in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and click mirror and weld, and you'll see this is fixed because it's whatever is on this side. If I want to, for example, add some horns to this character, I'm going to take my move brush, I'm going to enable AccuCurve. Remember, the AccuCurve is the one that gives you a more pointy effect. So I'm going to click and push this like that, and then I realize, oh, I'm not using symmetry. So you could have done it with symmetry, but let's say that you do something like that and you spend some time smoothing it and so on and so forth, and you want to go ahead and have exactly the same thing on the other side, we can go ahead and use mirror and weld, right? Or if you made a mistake, let's undo that. Let's say that you made a mistake and now this is on this side and you want to keep it clean, like on the right-hand side. If you use mirror and weld, what Siri is going to do is take, like I said, anything from this positive side to the negative side. So the easiest way to fix it is to mirror it first and then mirror and weld it, right? So I'm going to mirror it. And now the area that I want to get rid of is on this side. And now I can mirror and weld with whatever is in the clean area in a way. So that's why these two elements are so important and they work really well together as in combination, like I just showed you. But it's mainly to keep everything symmetrical and in shape, or to move things from one side to the other. That's kind of like the summary of this lesson. Just enable dynamic subdivision for all the different subtools so that you can have a smoother version, or pre-visualize this in a smoother version. I'm going to enable dynamic here for the head as well. Then the mirror and weld, which mirrors and weld things together, and the mirror that is basically to flip things from one side to the other. So we are pretty much done with this lesson. The last thing I want to do is to go ahead and create another eye, and that's why we're going to be using the mirror and weld. So personally, I like to have the eyes in the same subtool, but depending on the project that you want to work on later on, you might want to have the left eye on one subtool and the right eye in a different subtool. But in this case, we're going to keep things very simple. So I'm going to go ahead and hold the Alt key, click on the eye, and I'm going to click mirror and weld. So now this is going to be a perfect mirror of the placement of this eye, which is great. So now we have this the way that we want it to. Everything is looking pretty smooth, and we are ready to move on to the next lesson, where we're actually going to start tweaking this shape so that they don't look as primitive in a way. So we are going to start shaping things to look much nicer before we move into adding the rest of the assets. All right, so I'm going to leave this one here, and in the next lesson, we're going to resource back to the move brush and the AccuCurve, and we're going to start tweaking things to, again, enhance that silhouette, enhance that shape, and it's all about tweaking these volumes at this early stage before we move into adding details. All right, so I'll see you in the next video.